What's wrong with this brother? What is wrong with him?
No, Ron Artest is crazy.
He should be banned from the NBA.
Yeah. Artest has jumped over the scorer's table and is trying to get down to the bench. Artest is in the stands.
And so he is going to serve time in jail.
It's one thing to drink during halftime. It's another thing to admit it.
Ron Artest is crazy, but I also have to say Ron Artest is one of the nicest guys I've ever met in my life.
Ron Artest, Metta World Peace, Metta Artest, or whatever you want to call him, cemented himself as one of the most controversial players to ever touch a ball. Years of fans wanting him out of the NBA entirely to becoming one of the most lovable. This is the curious case of Ron Artest. Ron Artest was born into a difficult scenario. Living in Queens, New York, in the biggest housing project in the country, he often shared his 5-bedroom apartment with up to 16 people at a time, with even more coming in and out, as his family was known to sell drugs. He was a chippy kid. He was the son of a boxer, so he was no stranger to confrontation in any way. But once his parents split, his anger tended to get the better of him. He was emotionally volatile even before that. He was a big kid, and extreme emotional outbursts are not exactly safe coming from someone like this. His teachers were scared that his outbursts would lead to violence, and through their advice they found a counselor for his anger problem. Talking through his issues must have not done much, but through their advice they found an outlet for him to focus on while being able to release his pent-up emotion. As you probably guessed, this led him to the New York basketball scene, and he was the embodiment of that brand of basketball. An extremely emotional kid with extremely good size and athleticism. I'm guessing you can predict how this thing ended up. He was an ultra-competitive guy who did everything in his power to win. Best defender on every court he played on, whether the most talented guy or not. All-out physicality, and if he can't beat you in that regard, he would do it mentally. Being a standout competitor in Queens is beyond a ridiculous feat. Growing up playing in Rucker Park tournaments and pickup games, this is about the most physical and competitive environment on the basketball scene. Physical altercations and basically verbal assault are as common as shooting fouls, and when Ron was 12 years old, it even got to the point of a literal homicide on the court. While attending a YMCA-sponsored event, a member of the crowd ripped off a leg on the scorer's table, went onto the floor, and stabbed 19-year-old Dwight Newton right in front of Artest, leaving him dead on the floor. This crazed environment molded the player that we all know, and he began to catch some buzz in high school and on the AAU scene as the hyper-competitive, extremely tough kid that he was. Ron was a very good player, known for his versatility, being able to score on all 3 levels, being a rather high IQ player, and being an extremely elite defender. This talent led to LaSalle High School running up an undefeated season his senior year, and a 69-1 AAU record alongside Elton Brand and Lamar Odom. His play was standout, but when you saw him play, what stood out more was his overwhelming personality. This was highlighted during a warm-up that saw Ron pushing Elton Brand over a chair on the sideline after a disagreement. To many, he was a hothead nuisance to the world, but to St. John's University, he was their starting small forward. Leadership comes in many forms, I guess, and St. John's coach Fran Fraschilla found his guy. Ron did a lot of good at his time at St. John's. He was a great player, of course, but also was looked up to in the New York community, frequenting wheelchair games and other charitable events. But he wasn't always so nice. This guy could flip a switch at any point, and he's your worst nightmare. He got upset and threw every ball in the stands at practice, fought teammates, destroyed his coach's office. This guy was at best a wild card, or to be more blunt, was not mentally stable enough to be at his position. But talent is king, and he clearly benefited their team, immediately jumping from a 13-14 record to a 22-10 record, then a 28-9 record in his sophomore season. In a year that saw an Elite 8 appearance, and Artest averaging a total of 14.5, 6, and 4 with 2 steals and a block per game. He was an interesting prospect. He had some scoring potential, he was moderately athletic and could finish pretty well. His 3-point percentage jumped from 33 to 37% this year, so that's a big plus. And he was also quite the underrated facilitator as well. The eye test for this guy was where it really got interesting though. His foot speed was maybe a bit above average while being one of the best on-ball defenders at the college level. This guy was jacked, so it helps box guys up of course, and he made pretty good rotations. He provided defensive versatility while being an undersized wing who weirdly wasn't really fast enough to play another position, and served as a vocal leader while simultaneously being a complete loose cannon. Why did this work out for him? Probably because he was the most competitive guy in the fucking world. After declaring for the 1999 NBA draft, the question marks were so obvious that they were basically just accepted consequences of drafting Ron Artest. But he still went mid-first round in the draft at 16th overall alongside former teammate Elton Brand, who was selected first overall by the Chicago Bulls. This team was very bad in that they were completely rebuilding just 1 year withdrawn from Jordan's departure. The responsibility was pretty big. You're expected to come in and start the rebuild after one of the greatest dynasties in sports history. But Artest didn't exactly treat it as such. In fact, he basically made a mockery out of the franchise as a whole. He would frequently drink Henny at halftime. Yeah, actually. He partied day and night and, in his words, treated his Bull stint as an extended vacation. This got to the point that he had to get a part-time job at Circuit City to keep himself grounded. He was an NBA player making millions of dollars while being anything but a professional basketball player. Despite this, Artest was still a very solid NBA player, primarily for what he brought on the defensive end. The grit and physicality he played with growing up made the NBA a rather seamless transition. In fact, it was probably a cakewalk compared to the physical beatdowns that he was used to. In a rather famous instance now, he even broke Michael Jordan's ribs in a game during his camp. It's clear from Artest's living style that he probably had some problems mentally, and flushing his prescribed antidepressants down the toilet while living like a rock star really didn't help him, but his defense and physical prowess alone made him quite the valuable piece that the Bulls were holding onto, and after a couple of years of some horrible seasons, they grew incredibly impatient. Artest came out playing very well in his third season, so the Bulls pulled the trigger while his value was at its highest, packaging to the Pacers in a deal centered around Jalen Rose. The Pacers, although not as storied of a franchise, were a much better team and a much better fit. This team was led by the criminally underrated Jermaine O'Neal, who was emerging into a 20-10 guarantee, as well as the vocal leadership of an aging Reggie Miller. Artest saw some increases in his first full year with Indiana as his role increased. 15-5-3 is pretty decent production, even if it's on some mediocre shooting splits, but mixed with his defense, which seemed to get better day by day, Artest was a very valuable up-and-comer. He was still Ron Artest. Don't get it twisted, this didn't come with any shortage of drama, from his explosion on Pat Riley to destroying a TV in the Madison Square Garden and showing up to practice in a bathrobe. He came with his own unique set of issues, but he brought way more to the table that kind of made up for it. Reggie Miller was quite the intense player in his own regard and saw the bright side of Artest. He took him under a wing in his way and tried to pass on the franchise to him. Artest took an even bigger jump the following year. This went from being a fun young team to a legitimate title contender. And this was on the back of the improvements that he made in particular. Artest was the best perimeter defender in the league this year. His physicality allowed him to switch on to big guys while also being the best on-ball defender in the NBA. He played a unique brand of defense that didn't really show up on the stat sheet, but boy was it effective. I mean, this guy became just the 6th perimeter player in history to win the Defensive Player of the Year award, right in the middle of Ben Wallace's run of terror. With 5.2 defensive win shares and a 96 defensive rating, he was an all-time defender for sure. His offensive game also began to sprout, reaching 18 a game. It was still pretty raw, and he was kind of just good enough to get by and give shots to, but not good enough to be a go-to guy. But as the best defender on the floor 99% of the time, this was a dominating season. The Pacers ran up 61 wins this year, and once you cross that 60 mark, it's hard to look at you at anything other than a title contender. They ran through the first round, beat the Heat in 6, and then matched up with the last guys you want to see in the mid-2000s. The Pistons-Pacers 2004 matchup may not have seen a ton of nail-biters, but this was one of the most grittiest series I've ever seen in my life, with neither team ever scoring over 90 in any of the 6 games played. After tying the series 2-2, the Pacers collapsed on the back of a pitiful offensive performance from Artest, failing to hit 30% from the field. This loss was tough, but seemingly was the start of a very bright future for the Pacers roster. But this is also when Ron Artest began to fall into a hole that only he could really understand. The loss weighed on him, mixed with other factors like a loss in his family. He was struggling badly with his depression and anxiety at this point. It even got to where Artest actually planned to retire. I mean, he asked for the retirement papers and everything, but the Pacers convinced him otherwise. He was checked out clearly. I mean, he even asked for time off at the start of the season to promote his new rap album. He was not in the right state of mind, but when things were going wrong for him, there was really only one thing he knew how to do. Artest came out and played out of his mind to start the 2004 through 2005 season. Even offensively, he was remarkable. He was a juggernaut. He scored the ball incredibly efficiently, essentially 50-40-90 at 24 points a game, while being one of the best defenders that this game has ever seen. The Pacers were a big-time favorite to run away with this thing, and Ron Artest looked like legitimately one of the best players in the league. It was going to be something supernatural to slow this team down. But, that happened. November 19th, 2004 will forever be remembered as one of the darkest days in NBA history. A rematch against the Pistons brought out anger that I'm sure we all expected, but the rest looked straight out of a movie. Artest fouled Wallace hard at the end of the game, leading to an altercation between both teams. To calm himself down from the confrontation, Artest laid down on the scorer's table as the fight went on before getting hit with a beer thrown by a fan. And the rest is history.
Has jumped over the scorer's table and is trying to get down to the bench. Artest is in the stands. Oh, this is awful. Fans are getting involved. Steven Jackson's in the stands.
The Malice at the Palace is a well-covered story that still never ceases to amaze. This led to a suspension for the rest of the season for Artest and a $5 million fine, as well as suspensions for teammates Steven Jackson and Jermaine O'Neal, who assisted Artest in the brawl against the fans. This team really didn't get along, but they seemed to ride with Artest through the controversy despite the lack of focus that he showed for them, which made it even more of a backstabbing move when he requested a trade the following season. This damaged relationships even to this day, and buried his reputation even further than I thought possible. I mean, this move was disrespectful, straight up, after putting them through what he just pulled, and this move left a bad taste in the general fandom's mouths. Later the next year, he'd be traded to Sacramento, where his growth was stunted. This was the end of Ron Artest's run as an all-star level player. During this time, he did develop his game to be a better supporting piece, shooting up over league average for his second and third years playing in Sacramento from behind the three-point line. He even hit 20 points a game for them, which was the only time in his career, well, for the seasons that he didn't punch any fans anyways. Despite the production, Artest certainly faded from the limelight. I mean, he was like a number 2 guy on a below-average team, but the biggest talking point came from a domestic abuse charge caught in 2007, as well as an unrelated case that involved him relinquishing his dog because of malnutrition and neglect. He actually served jail time from the charges, spending 10 days in jail, and definitely cemented himself as the most hated guy in the NBA. At this point, it's hard to look at him as anything other than a shitty person. He was later traded to the Rockets to pair with T-Mac and Yao, and even they didn't seem too pleased about the trade. Despite being an elite defender who could shoot the ball at a 40% clip, he was still known as the guy who clocked some fans. The Rockets went into the playoffs with their share of injuries. Of course, this team is known as one of the biggest what-ifs, with their stars' careers being destroyed, but Artest was keeping these guys alive, whether you want to admit it or not. They pushed the championship Lakers to 7 despite Yao not playing most of the series and T-Mac not playing at all. This series was wild, with the wildest part involving an ejection after screaming in Kobe's face after Artest elbowed him. The loose cannon energy became synonymous with this guy, but aggression and competitive drive certainly go hand in hand. Kobe wanted this guy, and he actually got what he wanted. Artest was now a member of the Lakers, where his behavior was monitored and actually controlled. Kobe, as the ultimate competitor himself, demanded respect and discipline from everyone that he shared the floor with. But mixed with getting real help from a team psychologist, Artest actually began to leave his aggression on the defensive end. He was a game-changing pickup for them, and although his stats are certainly nothing crazy, the toughness that he provided was crucial for this team, and the veteran leadership paid dividends in the playoffs, as well as knocking down a game winner in the Western Conference Finals against the Suns and a dagger in Game 7 that sealed his first championship with a 20-point performance. He went on to have some viral post-game interviews during this playoff run that definitely changed his public perception a bit. He even apologized to his old Pacer teammates for giving up on them too early after his championship, and went on to patch up his relationship with Jermaine O'Neal after not being on speaking terms for all these years. His reputation really took an upswing, from his TV appearances to actual positive media coverage for once. Artest even pawned his championship ring to spark a mental health campaign to help people receive assistance that changed his life who otherwise wouldn't have any access to it. He really pushed his narrative to patch up the holes that his shenanigans ripped in his reputation, even changing his name to Metta World Peace to try and leave the past in the past. A competitor's a competitor. It'll never leave a kid. I mean, just ask James Harden. He learned that the hard way. But as Father Time caught up to him, he really turned his reputation into just a fun-loving vet who played harder than anyone on both ends of the ball. Artest went on to play for the Lakers for the next few years before leaving them for New York and playing overseas for a year, before eventually being brought back as a mentor for them in 2016 and retiring shortly after that. His post-basketball run still manages to be interesting. I mean, slowing down's not really in his playbook, it looks like, from developing the Airbnb of pickup games to graduating from UCLA, getting married, and changing his name again. He's definitely been active, but he has kept his foot on the gas for his ongoing campaign for mental health assistance. Ron Artest's story seems to have a storybook ending in a way. From just a kid playing on the streets to a guy at the top of the world who lost it all on a whim, before devoting his life to the same issues which nearly destroyed him, the perfect imperfections of the Ron Artest saga make it a story worth telling and one that we'll sure as hell never see anything like again. Thank you for watching if you made it this far, and I'll see you boys in the next one. Peace out.